Hello, everyone, and welcome to Missouri Rural Crisis Center's second Farm Bill webinar, where today we're digging in on Farm Bill and the impacts that it has on factory farms, conservation, and competition. My name is Dina Vanderzalm. I'm the Community Engagement Director with the Missouri Rural Crisis Center, and I will be facilitating today's conversation. I'm joined today by Ben Lilliston, Doug Doty, and Rhonda Perry, who are going to help us understand how the many programs and policies that farmers, consumers, conservationists, environmentalists, and more depend on every day fit into the Farm Bill. And for those of you who missed our conversation last week, we really dug in more on the Farm Bill 101 aspects, looking at the different and diverse programs and titles that make up the Farm Bill, looking at the spending and the timelines and how the process all works. Talking everything from like nutrition and safety net programs to, how forestry, conservation, and ag policy fits into that. So if you missed that recording, it's available on our YouTube, and we can link it in the follow-up from this one as well. Before we get started here, I want to tell you a little bit about our speakers, and then let you know we'll be holding questions for the end for a Q&A, but please feel free to submit your questions as you think of them using the Q&A feature down at the bottom. If there's anything that's like a quick clarifying question, there's a lot of acronyms in this world. We'll try to be mindful of explaining those as we go. We'll try to grab those, but go ahead and submit them as you think of them, and we'll grab as many as we can at the end. And then as a note, this is also being recorded, and we will send the recording and the slides afterwards. So I want to introduce our speakers here. Ben Lilliston is the Director of Rural Strategies and Climate Change at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, which along with MRCC, Missouri Rural Crisis Center, is a member of Campaign for Family Farms and the Environment. Ben works with Midwest, national, and international partners to build a policy framework for farmers and rural communities in responding to the climate crisis. And he frequently writes about the intersection of climate, agriculture, and trade policy. Doug Doty is a row crop and cattle farmer from Livingston County, Missouri. He's an avid longtime no-tiller who's incorporated some other conservation practices on his farm you'll hear about shortly, things like crop rotations, waterways, cover crops, field borders, terraces, and ponds since all the way back in the 1980s. And he focuses on reducing inputs, curbing soil erosion, and most recently processing the nutrients before they leave his fields. So Doug's goal, which I think is a wonderful one, is to preserve and sustain his family's farmland, some of that dating back 185 years through these regenerative agriculture practices. And then finally, we'll hear from Rhonda Perry. Rhonda is a fifth generation Missouri farmer who has called Howard County, Missouri home for over 30 years. She really got started in this having watched her family defending their farm back in the foreclosure crisis of the 1980s, and decided to dedicate her career to really giving voice to those farmers in rural communities. She acted as the program director for Missouri Rural Crisis Center for about 30 years before becoming our executive director back in 2020. And as a cattle farmer herself, she really helps ensure that our work stays grounded in the real lived experiences and voices of rural and farm families. So with that, I will hand it over to Ben to talk to us a little bit about the corporatization of the Farm Bill. Thanks for joining us, Ben.
Great, thanks very much for having me. Thanks for MRCC for inviting me to this conversation. Yeah, my name is Ben Lilliston. I work at the Institute for Ag and Trade Policy. We're based in Minnesota. We have an office in Washington, D.C., as well as one in Berlin, Germany. And we were also kind of came together during the 80s farm crisis to better understand how national and international policies impact family farmers, rural communities, the environment, the food system on the ground. And the Farm Bill is a big part of that. The Farm Bill is, the most important food and farm policy in the United States every 5 years. And it sounds like you heard a lot about that in the previous webinar, but I'm going to talk about how agribusiness benefits from these Farm Bill programs and factory farms as part of agribusiness. So we can go to the next slide. I think it's important to ground ourselves a little bit in, how different constituencies see the Farm Bill. And these are sort of some public interest goals around the Farm Bill that I don't think are too controversial. This is hundreds of billions of dollars being spent we should get some good public interest outcomes of the Farm Bill. But agribusiness has a very specific goals around the Farm Bill. They want abundant, cheap commodities, and commodities I'm talking about grains and food grown through the commodity programs. So corn, soy, wheat, rice, cotton are some of the bigger ones in that commodity program. They want government support for factory farms, so public spending in different ways. They want free trade, imports and exports, to move goods across borders, and in some cases move animals across borders. They want voluntary environmental action, not actual regulations that require environmental protection. And they want weak antitrust or anti-competitive enforcement. They don't want government interfering in their market. And so these are some of their goals in the Farm Bill. We can go to the next slide. And these 3 years are really important, I think, in understanding our current Farm Bill and how agribusiness benefits. In 1994, North American Free Trade Agreement passed. That's the US, Canada, and Mexico. First regional free trade agreement that really set the template for future free trade deals. And then in 95, you have the World Trade Organization, which set global trade rules for 150 countries around the world. Agribusiness very closely monitored and lobbied on that formation. And then in 96, you have the Freedom to Farm bill. And that Farm Bill really got rid of a lot of restrictions on production, got rid of price floors, which influenced the market, and really said, we're going to grow as much as we possibly can to reach those export markets. The US is going to feed the world, right? And so that meant sort of turbocharged commodity crop production, as well as the factory farm system that was already growing rapidly. We can go to the next slide. I'm not sure if we are able to get to the next slide. Oh, there we are. Okay, good. So I put this in here just to show the outcome of those 3 policies. Here you have you can see in 94 and 96, slow growth of exports, both imports and exports, and then you see an explosion, right? And this year, pretty remarkable, we will actually import more than we will export in terms of value. That is something that I think most people did not anticipate in the 90s, but it was an obvious kind of logical and rational outcome of those 3 policies. So, if you drive around the country, we have so much incredible farmland, so much acres into farming, and yet we're going to be importing more food. So instead of, feeding the world, we're not even really feeding ourselves. But for an agribusiness standpoint, particularly these global companies, it doesn't matter to them where the food is produced. They have operations all over the world, and if they can get it cheaper, they'll import. If they can produce it cheaper here, they'll do that. So this is just an outcome of those policies, and really an outcome of our Farm Bill. We can go to the next slide. So real quickly, you may have seen this in the last webinar, but this is a breakdown of Farm Bill spending. And I'm just going to talk about the 4 biggest programs and in terms of spending, and how agribusiness and food companies benefit from those programs. And you can see nutrition is far and away the biggest program within the Farm Bill. We can go to the next one. Yeah, here we go. So Title I and Title IX are 2 really critical programs for agribusiness and factory farms. These programs really incentivize farmers to grow commodity crops, which is what they need to either produce ethanol or biofuels, to produce animal feed, to produce that go into processed food, or to export internationally. And as I mentioned, those are corn, soybeans, wheat, cotton, rice, those types of crops. And what the Title I does is it sets a reference price And then if the market price goes below that reference price, the government's going to pay you the difference. And so it guarantees farmers a certain amount of income for those commodity crops. And then Title IX crop insurance covers if there's some kind of natural event, weather event that affects your yield. And so then that's when crop insurance comes in. And both of those programs work hand in hand to really manage risk for farmers and reduce risk. And they're also very important for when the farmer, if they have to get a loan from the bank knows that the government is sort of backing and has some that you're at least covered and you're going to get a minimum income out of it. Now we know those reference prices don't often cover the cost of production. That doesn't mean that farmers are making a lot of money, but it gives them some insurance. And so it really is, those two programs are why we have so much corn, soy, wheat out there, including cotton and rice as well. Those are the big five. And of course, that means often the market price dips below the cost of production. That's a big benefit for the grain companies. That's a big benefit for the factory farm animal system, whether it's hog, beef, cattle, beef, dairy, or poultry. They're all benefiting from really often below cost feed. And the government, while it's paying farmers to kind of make up the difference, in essence, that subsidy is passing through the farm and going to these big agribusiness companies. So these are key programs for the whole factory farm system. I'll talk a little bit more about conservation and how the factory farm system also takes money from that program. We could go to the next slide. So we put out a report earlier this year that found that 3 out of every 4 farmers who apply for these 2 big conservation programs are turned down. And that's the Conservation Stewardship Program and the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. These are hugely popular programs. Farmers want to get into them. They want to add more conservation to their land. And some of it is that there's not enough money. So, they're not able to access the program. But another key part of it is agribusiness and factory farms in particular are sucking up a lot of that money, are gobbling it up and closing out other farmers from these programs. So we can go to the next slide. I apologize for all the slides. I just felt like I needed to put them in here. But you can see under EQIP, the bolded practices. These are the different type EQIP funds, somewhere around 100, maybe even a little bit more than that, different practices. And the bolded practices are ones that are used by factory farms. They also are among the most expensive practices in EQIP. So you can see how that system is gobbling up a lot of money that could be spent for farmers doing real conservation, whether it's cover crops, putting in perennials, pollinators, fencing for managed grazing. And instead, it's going to kind of help this factory farm system manage their waste, the enormous amount of waste that they're producing in one concentrated area. The number 1 ranked most expensive practice is anaerobic digesters. And here you have big meat and dairy companies sort of working alongside the natural gas industry to capture gas from those really large manure lagoons and send it into the natural gas pipeline. We can talk about that later if you want, but that's a big goal for agribusiness right now in responding to climate change. We can go to the next slide. So lastly, I thought it was just worth pointing out also that big supermarkets and food companies also benefit from the SNAP program, which is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. You can see rural communities do benefit from this program quite a bit. 19% of SNAP recipients work in food and farming. Walmart and McDonald's, many of their employees have the most employees who actually use SNAP. So that shows how much they're getting paid and that they need that kind of assistance. And then Walmart captures over a quarter of SNAP dollars. So even in the SNAP program, you have powerful companies that are really benefiting from this program and how it works. Thanks very much. That's my last slide, and I appreciate it. Look forward to questions.
Thank you so much, Ben. And I think it's really important to look at how all these systems are working together, and I'm sure we'll get some questions about it. Next, I want to hand it over to Doug Doty, because it's one thing to kind of talk about these programs, and it's a totally different thing to see how they are a lived experience. So thanks for joining us.
All right, thanks, Dina. Excellent, Ben. Appreciate that. Ben noted in one of his slides that conservation makes up about 7% of the Farm Bill, and that's what we're going to talk about. And really, this is what it's all about. This is what 8,000 to 10,000 years of soil and water stewardship looks like. This soil profile is on my sister's farm that was homesteaded by our ancestors in the 1830s. As far as we know, it hasn't been disturbed by tillage. You're looking at about 12 to 18 inches of topsoil. Fun fact, an acre of that profile would weigh about 3,000 tons. That's the rich soil from what once was part of the tall grass prairie that is largely responsible for our nation's agriculture success. I'd like to take credit for that, but we didn't build that. That credit goes to glaciers, weathering, and the 400 generations of Native Americans before us. They have the conservation story to tell. And as we move to slide 2, Dina, let's face it, in some sense, ours is a story of extraction and pollution. The 2023 Farm Bill needs to be more about further transforming our practices from extractive to regenerative. We've made some headway. We need to make a lot more. So, quick quiz. In what year did the University of Missouri Agriculture Experiment Station make this statement after a comprehensive study of soils in North Missouri? Quote, "Erosion has seriously impaired the quality of the soils and is a major problem in this part of the state." End quote. If you said 1962, you would be correct. But we're not alone, are we? Studies indicate that soil thickness on the prairies in the entire Midwest has declined at an average rate of nearly 2 millimeters per year over 150 years. That's the equivalent of 12 inches of topsoil. Overall, we've lost about 1/2 of our topsoil in 150 years. What took 10,000 years to build, we've lost in 150. And here we are in 2023, still losing close to 6 tons of topsoil per acre per year. 2 pictures on the left are examples of gully erosion and some real erosion in the area, filling some of the road ditches, meandering down to the streams. The pictures, the picture in the center and the picture on the right, are 2 pictures on our farms that caught my attention in recent times. The middle picture, the farm was purchased in the 1980s. The field is terraced. It's been no-tilled, and when there used to be just a rock here and there, but after we've had excessive rain events, excessive weather events, I started to see this in the field. And this field is now in the CRP Tall Grass Prairie program. The field on the right, that happened after an excessive rainfall of about 6 to 8 inches in 2 to 3 hours. You can see the terrace topped and caused a lot of erosion. That field had been no-tilled since the 1970s. Terraces, obviously, it needs more attention than just terraces, no-tills, and waterways. So moving to slide 3, as our topsoil has depleted, what's been our answer? We fertilize more to maintain productivity, don't we? And that leads to this, the dead zone. Nutrient pollution from commercial fertilizers and animal manure are majorly responsible for creating the dead zone in the Gulf that is costing the seafood industry at least 2.4 billion a year and the tourism industry millions along that Gulf Coast. Walk it backwards through the entire basin and think about the impaired rivers, streams, lakes, and wells. The things that we're doing to cause the dead zone are also causing our drinking and recreational waters to become polluted and costly to treat. So in case you're wavering, as we move to the next slide, in case you're wavering, CO2 levels are the highest in 800,000 years. Oceans are heating up. And I was in a winter meeting a couple of years ago that our seed corn dealer was putting on, and a representative from a company that produces some microbials. So he was a former University of Missouri hydrologist, researcher, and he stood in front of about 40 farmers and told us, if you don't believe in climate change, you need to. And here's why. And he gave the statistic that from the 1800s to 1980, that rainfall from that 1st of April to the end of June was static. Didn't vary a lot. Yes, we had droughts, we had a few extreme weather events, but it was basically static on a graph. But from 1980 to today, that rainfall from April 1st to June 30th over the entire Midwest has nearly doubled. And again, he said, if you don't believe in climate change, you need to. So the thought crossed my mind that when we hear the words, the cattle are out, it's an immediate mad scramble. It's not voluntary that everyone pitches in and helps them get back in, is it? Livestock are valuable, plus they're a liability threat, right? They might damage someone's property, maybe cause an accident. When the cattle get out, when any livestock gets out, we rush to get them back in and then fix the fence, double chain the gate. Does a recent dust storm in Illinois come to mind here? So why isn't it an industry-wide that we have the same urgency when it comes to keeping nutrients and soil in our fields? That leads to this question: how do we manage farmland in an era when our climate lurches from brutal drought to excessive rainfall and flooding, sometimes negatively impacting our environment and neighbors? So I have an idea. And we move to slide number 6. It's not an original idea, but I'm going to expound on this idea and relate it to the 2023 Farm Bill. I came across this video of Keith Schilling with the Iowa Geological Survey. He was talking about the studies they're doing regarding the importance of grass waterways and grass in road ditches, and he referred to it as processing nutrients. What they were finding was that waterways and road ditches would absorb some of the nutrients that were running off farm fields and through the miles and miles of their tiled fields. And it struck me that that is the mindset we need. We can't fence or wall off our nutrients and soil and keep them in our fields, but we can process them in our fields. Coincidentally, this spring I had an equipment malfunction. And if you look at the picture on the right, I started applying nitrogen in the field that is on the left side of that road ditch, and I came to the end and I picked up the toolbar and a fitting broke, and I had to get off the tractor, crawl under the applicator and shut off the valve. But about 100 gallons of liquid nitrogen ran out, and you can see where it first killed the grass, And then we had a rain the next night and it washed down the ditch. But you can see how that road ditch with the grass left in it, how it processed that liquid nitrogen. It got smaller and smaller, and it didn't make it to the bottom of that hill where it would have crossed and into a neighbor's pond. So if that ditch worked to process my blunder, think what that field border does, or what an entire field of cover crops will do to process nutrients from an extreme weather event. So that light bulb moment was brought to me by not only the Iowa Geological Survey video, but USDA programs like CRP, Conservation Reserve Program, CSP, Conservation Stewardship Program, and EQIP. Those programs offer solutions through continuing education. Bill Richards is a former NRCS, the head of NRCS during the early 90s. He was a no-till farmer from Ohio, and he was instrumental in the start of the EQIP program. Back then, he made the quote, "You can't just throw money at the problem. You've got to teach somebody how to do it. And so far, we're just throwing money at it." Well, I've used these programs and learned the benefits of field borders, rotational grazing, slow release nitrogen fertilizer products, seeding the most vulnerable soils back to prairie grasses and pollinators. There are hundreds of practices to experiment with that might fit many different farms. These programs develop good habits. But before we ask what taxpayers and USDA can do for us, what can we do on our own? So we can reduce nitrogen applications. We can follow university guidelines that show a lot of us are applying too much nitrogen. We can buffer streams. We can plant buffers and close to streams and rivers and not plant right up to those streams and rivers. We can follow nutrient management plans and not over apply animal manure and commercial fertilizer. And finally, what's next for our farm? We're currently looking into seeding prairie strips into some strategic locations within some fields. Iowa State University research shows by converting 10% of our fields to native perennials, we can reduce sediment movement by 95%, plus reduce nitrogen by 90% and phosphorus by 85%. It's a whole bunch of benefits with a little bit of this. Isn't that also the mindset that's needed when thinking about the Farm Bill? The EQIP program was not designed back in 1996 to be a Christmas tree for CAFOs. Why are we funding methane digesters, lagoons, lagoon covers? As Ben's organization, IATP, noted in a recent report, USDA turned away roughly 3 out of 4 farmers who applied for EQIP and CSP in 2022. We need to get back to the original intent of programs like EQIP, CSP, and make available a whole bunch of benefits with a little bit of this for a diverse range of farming operations. Thanks, and I'll turn it back to Dina.
Thank you so much, Doug. I love your pictures too. I think it really helps to like come home. And I think we've got a couple of questions for you after this, but I'll go ahead and turn it over to Rhonda to help us make some connections to the competitions and kind of what this looks like from here.
Thanks, Dina and Doug and Ben. It's always super helpful, I think, to have both the history of how we got here, as well as have like the real time, here's what's happening and here are the things that farmers are doing. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. It's a great crowd. We're super excited that so many people are interested in having this conversation about the Farm Bill. I think it demonstrates that we all know there's some things that could go better and some things that we want to see in the future. And again, just as a reminder, if you're just joining this video and you didn't see the previous one, that will be in a link that we send around as well. And that will have some great stats and information about how the Farm Bill, all the different titles of the Farm Bill and how they work together. As Dina said, I'm a family farmer, 5th generation in Missouri. And so I'm going to talk about this a little bit from the farmer perspective about why we care about this Farm Bill. And we just heard a lot of reasons from both Ben and Doug about why we care. And I'm particularly focused on livestock. So I sort of come at this from the fact that farmers like Doug and like myself and the thousands of other family farmers in our state, we're responsible for the animals and the land 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, through all kinds of weather, whether it's natural disasters or sometimes man-made disasters or sometimes big policy mistakes. And economic crises, like we are still responsible, and we've invested a lot to make sure that we are protecting our land and the animals that we raise. So in spite of that, crazily enough, we as farmers don't even get 15% of the consumer dollar. So 14.5 cents is what we get from every consumer dollar. That seems wrong, but it's also not an accident. And we're going to talk about like how we got there. For Missouri in particular, obviously the Farm Bill, super important on these issues of factory farms and conservation and consolidation of the livestock industry, because we have the 2nd largest number of family farms in the country after only Texas, over 95,000 family farms. We have the 2nd largest number of cattle operations in the country, also after only Texas. We have 53,000 cattle operations in our state. Agriculture is still the major economic driver for most rural communities. It is frequently the single most important and biggest economic driver for our entire state. So I think for Missouri, we have a vested interest in really caring what happens in this Farm Bill. The other thing that we have, I think that is at the top of a lot of our minds, is what we just saw during COVID happens with a very centralized food system. It did not benefit family farmers. It was clearly not benefiting consumers, and it definitely wasn't benefiting workers during that COVID time as well. So all of like the problems of this corporate controlled consolidated system really became a lot more apparent during COVID. So I think this is a time we have to try to fix some of those problems. And we're super glad that you're here today to work with us on how we can do that. I'm going to talk a little bit first about, I'm going to tell a short story. It's a short but scary story about an American agriculture industry and what has happened to it in one generation. I'm going to talk a little bit about some Farm Bill priorities related to these issues in particular. Then we're going to have a conversation about challenges and opportunities that we see right now in this Farm Bill debate. And then we're going to talk about some very tangible, immediate next steps that we can take. So first, the scary story. This is sort of an advantage. We have the ability to see an industry and what happened to an industry in literally one generation with these policies that Ben talked about. And many of them were part of the Farm Bill. But what we saw, and this is the hog industry, of course, and this isn't a hypothetical. We don't have to say, we have the luxury of not having to say, well, what if we had these bad policies? What would happen? Because we can see it in an industry right now, what happened. And what happened was we lost 90% of the hog farmers in our state. We lost over 80% in the country. The retail price of pork, you were like, well, maybe it was more efficient. Maybe it's going to be better for consumers. Maybe it's the best way to move forward, more environmentally sound, good for everyone. But that 90% of hog farmers we lost in Missouri was a major economic hit for rural communities, because that was people who were buying their inputs, paying for people to truck their hogs. All of the expenses around the hog industry were really very much localized. And when we lost the hog industry in terms of 90% of the hog farmers, it really impacted our rural communities. It's a retail price of pork. You think that went down? It went up 305% in this same period of time. The farmer share of the retail dollar went down 49%. So consumers did not benefit, farmers didn't benefit. I think we can figure out who did benefit, were those people in the middle that gained control of the system. And two of those entities who gained significant control resulted in two foreign corporations, Smithfield and JBS, now controlling half of an entire American agriculture industry. So I think we have to think about, at what point do we lose those industries? At what point do we say, is that an American industry anymore, when it's more than half, when it's 70% controlled by two foreign corporations? So I think those results are super clear. The bad news is a lot of that happened significantly because of bad policies that people made. The good news is that a significant part of that happened because of bad policies that people made. And that means they can unmake them. And that's what farm bills are all about. And the reason the hog industry is so important, and I wanted to raise it, is because many of the programs and actions really came together from these farm policies. It was a perfect storm for really ensuring that taxpayer dollars were going to fuel this entire industrialization. From the commodity title that created cheap grain that Ben talked about, to the credit title that meant that taxpayers were backing up loans to these factory farms, to the conservation title, in which EQIP funding, as we heard, was substantially going to fund this industrialization, the cleanup of waste with very non-productive and expensive services that taxpayers were providing. And then you can even go as far as to say, even the nutrition title of that farm bill and the existence of food stamps, which we support because it really helps rural communities, but it really also is a very tangible, specific subsidy to these agribusiness corporations who do not pay people real money for a living. We can flip to the first slide now, Dina. So I think where we commit this is from the perspective of, we can't afford to see any more agriculture industries go down this road, particularly cattle, because it's such a huge program for Missouri, and many of us are livestock farmers. These are priorities specifically related to these issues that we're talking about, to factory farms and conservation. So first of all, stop subsidizing corporate factory farms and literally the consolidation with taxpayer dollars. And we heard how EQIP did that. There was an attempt in the last farm bill, and there may be an attempt again, to allow the conservation stewardship program to be accessed by industrial agriculture operations. The other interesting thing that is happening simultaneous with this farm bill is the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, which is providing $20 billion to support conservation programs. So there's going to be a lot of money flowing into these conservation programs. So it's our job to make sure that that money gets targeted to the very family farmers and rural communities that we need it to go to, versus just to a bunch of corporate livestock operations who then may get bought out by Smithfield, a Chinese-owned company in the end. So like, what are our priorities, and how we make sure that money is targeted is super critical. Breaking up meat packing giants and addressing mergers in agribusiness. Here's a few scary stats about why that is super important. And I hesitate to name these but you'll get these after the fact. So I'm going to go ahead and name them. These same corporations who control the hog industry, they also control poultry, they control beef. In the poultry industry, who vastly controls it, JBS, again, the Brazilian company, Tyson, Purdue, Wayne Sanderson. In beef, it's JBS, Tyson, Cargill, Mayfrig. In pork, it's JBS, Smithfield, Hormel, and Tyson. You hear those names over and over again, JBS, Tyson. And of course, remembering JBS and Smithfield controlling half of the pork industry. Super important that we address these mergers and buyouts, because how a Chinese corporation ended up controlling 25% of the pork industry is because over a period of time, Premium Standard Farms sold out to got bought out by Continental Grain, who got bought out by Smithfield, who had already bought out two of the largest corporations in the country, who then got bought out by a Chinese corporation. So we can see all those buyouts and mergers matter, and we should challenge them and look at them every time they come up, because in the end, it could just be one person owning entire industries. If we don't want this kind of system of total corporate control of our food, we also have to support what we do want. And that's where the prioritizing family farm livestock and independent processing comes in. We need to invest in. And there is money, as people have heard, flying all over Washington, D.C. right now. And we need to make sure, once again, that it is coming to the places that we really need to be participating in our food production, so that it is not centralized and it can be diversified. Obviously, one of the things that was near and dear to our hearts and that we've worked on for many years is restoring competition to livestock markets. And as you could see, thinking back to those names I just read about who's in control of entire industries, but also cross industries, you can clearly see the system isn't working. The marketplace is not working for family farmers. And like, if the marketplace doesn't work, then literally what do we have? We have to be able to have a functioning marketplace. And that means we need some of these policies, including mandatory country of origin labeling. We need meat packers to be buying in open, fair, and competitive markets and not rigging the system. And we need USDA to enforce the laws that are on the books. And Dina, you can flip to the next page. So these are some of the bills that are currently introduced, bills or acts. And this is important, because to garner support for the things we want in a farm bill, we need things that act as marker bills. We need things that we can organize around leading up to the farm bill. And a lot of the issues that we're discussing today have actually been introduced in the form of bills and are out there. So that's super great news. And these are tools for us to be able to use and to take action on and to demonstrate support for. So there are merger moratorium bills, and I encourage you to check these out. And these slides will be available after the fact as well. And we really have to be able to address these anti-competitive mergers when they happen. You can't, like, it's very hard to go back and try to redo what has already happened, but we can do it in real time, and we need to have a commitment to that. President Biden issued an executive order that specifically addresses enforcing the Packers and Stockyards Act, closing the country of origin labeling loophole, and right to repair. These are all issues that are part of a competition and anti-concentration order that was very good. Now, our role is we got to make sure they implement these things. And we will talk about some very specific actions that you can take related to this, the country of origin labeling loophole. Please stay tuned so that you can learn how to take action, because the deadline for making comments on that loophole change is this coming Sunday, and we'll tell you how to do it. And that loophole is one that currently allows imported goods to be brought into the U.S., slightly repackaged, and then called product of the U.S. completely false labeling, and this would close that loophole and make that illegal. We also need, though, in addition, mandatory country of origin labeling for all products that come in to this country, particularly meat products. We need to make sure they are labeled, just like all of our clothes are labeled, where they are from. And there is a bill called the American Beef Labeling Act that we are supporting. We hope you will support. Protecting America's meatpacking workers. We saw that like what happens is the exploitation of not just farmers, but also workers in this system. And we know that if these corporations had to pay farmers a fair price, had to pay their workers a fair price, then, and had to pay fast food workers a fair price for that matter, I think there's enough room in agriculture for all of us to make a decent living. We just need to make sure that it isn't two corporations in the middle who want to take it all while we all are lagging behind. There's also a great bill called the Environmental Quality of Incentives Program Act, which would address a lot of the issues that was really enabling the funding of the not super effective practices that industrial livestock operations use that Ben talked about. So a lot of these things would be reined in, and those more ineffective practices would only get 40% cost share, and the family farm practices like Doug is talking about and uses on his farm would be at 75%. We think we need to target where we want our taxpayer dollars to go. Next slide, Dina. And this is a quick review of what we're up against. We have a September 30th deadline. Lots of things could happen to that, but we know it's a for real deadline and that we need to do as much as we can to weigh in. We have heard, and we just heard here today, the long history of, and this is a challenge, people are used to these systems of taxpayer funded industrialization against our own industries. So it's hard to make people, sometimes hard to make people care because like we're just used to this system, but it's a bad system. Obviously we have role of corporate lobbyists. Those companies that we've named who control major parts of the industry, they didn't get there by accident. They got there because they lobbied for the policies that enabled them to get where they are, to take over entire markets with no retribution. And then of course there's the narrative, and I think Ben addressed this a little bit, that the Farm Bill is about, oh, the rural people got to get their thing, and that's somehow against the consumers who need to get what they need. So pitting the titles against each other and pitting farmers against consumers and rural against urban, we can't buy into any of that, because this Farm Bill has got to be about all of us. It has to be about food, and it has to be about what's good for farmers and consumers. Next slide, Dina. Opportunities. We've been around a block or time or two. It's clear we've seen what we've seen and we know what the results are, and we can talk about them, and we need to talk about them. We have a history of success on programs like what we just heard from Doug today, of things that can really work for family farmers. We have a lot of marker bills and executive orders that emphasize corporate control, competition, and antitrust. We have a lot of opportunities to talk to people who don't come from just the farmer perspective on this Farm Bill. And that includes a lot of you all who are on this meeting. So we're grateful that you're part of this conversation. And lastly, we have tools right now that we'll tell you about that are on the next steps page that we can do and take action on right now to make a difference. So Dina, you can flip to the next steps slide. I think we're going to put in the Q&A a link that enables you to take action on these things right now. Don't cut yourself off of Zoom, because we're going to do a couple minutes, 10 minutes of Q&A, 10 or 15 minutes of Q&A, and we'll try to wrap up by 5 after for sure. So you have an opportunity, first and foremost, to submit a comment on why we need to close the loophole. We will send you, the link will take you to a place that gives you talking points. The deadline is Sunday, so super important that we weigh in on that. We have 2 petitions that we would love for you to gather signatures for. If you have not already signed the petitions, please sign the petitions. If you have signed the petitions on mandatory country of origin labeling and enforcing the country's antitrust laws, we would urge you to circulate those. Think about the lists you have and how you might be able to circulate those. We also have a link where you can tell your story about why you care, through photos or through a video about why you care about the Farm Bill, why you care about rural Missouri, why you care about being a Missourian, and all that involves. So we hope you'll participate in that. And we hope you'll sign up to get involved. There is a sign up sheet to get more information about the Farm Bill, and that will let you know all of the steps going on in this Farm Bill process, when we can take action, give you some of the tools to take the action, and we'll stick with it, not just through the Farm Bill debate and passage, but also through the implementation, because that's also a key part that makes these programs work for farmers or work for corporate agriculture. So thanks again for joining us, and I will flip back to Dina, who's going to take us through some questions and answers.
Absolutely. And I'll invite all of our speakers here to come back on video. And we've gotten a couple of really good questions in. Rhonda, we have one kind of clarifying question from Dana. You were talking about the number of Missouri farms being the second highest in the nation, and she's asking if that includes those that are under contract by corporations. If you could just talk about that. What makes Missouri unique, sort of thing.
Yep, it would include those numbers as well. The ones it would actually include all farms, but the vast majority of farms in Missouri are independent family farms without contracts. I will look this up for sure, but it has historically been like 0.5% of farming operations are CAFOs. Missouri has a very small number of CAFOs, and I think we want to keep it that way in terms of our Midwestern neighbors. And part of that is because we have historically had local control and been able to address these issues at the local level. So we may see more CAFOs, but right now Missouri does have the vast majority, over 99%, are family farm operations.
Fantastic.
Thanks for the question.
So I have a question for Ben. If you could address a little bit what we're seeing with biogas and the billions of dollars of climate money kind of going to, a little bit more about those anaerobic digesters and how that all kind of is fitting in with our climate dollars.
Yeah, so there's a growing pressure on the meat and dairy industry to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And I think I saw a question also about climate, and the major sources of emissions from agriculture are from methane and from nitrous oxide, which is linked to fertilizer, and methane from animals, but also the manure. And so in this factory farm system, what they're trying to do is capture that methane gas from the factory farm system, the giant manure lagoons, often hog, dairy, some of the beef feedlots too, and then pipe that into natural gas pipelines. And the natural gas industry can then call that as renewable, and it qualifies them for all kinds of public subsidies. And so in the Farm Bill, it is the EQIP program, and it's also a program called REAP, which is Renewable Energy for America program. And there was just a hearing this morning that we were watching before the Senate Budget Committee, where a proponent of biogas got up and talked about how they got close to $800,000 for their methane digester from those two programs. And just to wrap up, that one of the real concerns is it creates new incentives to get bigger and bigger. If you're making money from your manure, you're going to get your herd size bigger, and then it just allows the factory farm system to grow. Farmers that are small scale or mid-size are not really going to be able to tap into that digester system. So it really further solidifies corporate control of agriculture, and then brings in the fossil fuel industry into agriculture.
Yeah, it's not a marriage you want to see there. We had a question from Darvin about beef imports. And I was thinking of your graph when Rhonda was talking about our country of origin loophole moment here where we can put some pressure on them to really reinforce cool here. But are the beef imports increasing because of high beef cattle prices and lower cow inventory? That may be a Rhonda question, but it may be a bit.
I'll answer real quickly. Yeah, I mean, our cattle herd, people are not aware, the U.S. cattle herd is I think at its smallest level since 1962. And it does have to do with the drought that's been going on, and people are, I'm sure, are somewhat aware of that out west. And yes, under NAFTA, you have animals crossing borders. They may start out their lives in Mexico, come up to the US to be finished. It's a global system. And when there's shortages or prices get too high here in the US, they're going to import it. And to Rhonda's point about country of origin labeling, they don't have to label that. So when you go into the supermarket, you don't know where that beef came from. And there's no requirement for those companies to list that. So there's no doubt that that's part of the dynamic.
I've got a question for Doug. When you think of the programs that you have used, is there anything you would change about them? I know some of them are time limited, and or what were some of the barriers you came up against trying to implement some of these changes on your own farm?
Well, I did. I was only successful once in qualifying for an EQIP loan or the EQIP program, and that was for a pond. And I've been turned down many times for EQIP, and I'd kind of change up the practices. And so when I was successful with CSP, that was back in the early 2010s, and that graph showed that there were a high percentage of people were accepted, and then it's kind of gone downhill from there. And the CSP program is where I picked up on some cover crops and field borders and all of those things. Now, especially the field borders, it makes me want to do the prairie strips. I saw the success. I saw what those field borders could do, and so I'm going to I've already applied for the CP43 program for a farm with prairie strips, and I'm really looking forward to that program.
And Rhonda, we talked about the importance of all these policies, the timelines of these things. What happens if the Farm Bill debate doesn't happen on time, right? It does have an expiration date.
I'm really gonna pitch it to Ben, but a couple things can happen, and it's like gets more, it gets complicated. But I mean, it will literally, a lot of those programs will expire on September 30th at the deadline if we don't have a new farm bill. No. But there could be an extension where they don't finish the farm bill, but they extend some of those programs so that they can continue. I think that has happened before. And some, farmers, some of those programs, some programs did keep going, but some we ran into major problems where, like the livestock program itself, I think the livestock disaster program didn't end up, people were applying in 2012 for that farm bill, and it didn't actually happen until 2014. So people had to really survive for, several years. So I think there's a couple ways that it can be, but something will have to happen on the 30th, either an extension or passage, and Ben would maybe be able to give us more info too.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think a lot of people expect it to be extended right now because they're really far behind in writing the Farm Bill. But yes, they could extend it. The issue Rhonda's talking about is the Farm Bill has mandatory funding for some programs that are just going to happen no matter what, and then there's every year, some programs have to get special appropriations that go through the different ag committees. And those are the ones that there's a real problem when the farm bill doesn't get passed. And a lot of that is, it's, sort of those kinds of programs that Rhonda mentioned, some of the local food oriented programs. And then, we have all this Inflation Reduction Act money coming through, where you see Republicans are really trying to attack those programs and claw back some of that money that would go into conservation. So there's a lot of dynamics going on, and things are very much in flux, and that's a great time for advocacy to let people know, what your priorities are.
That's a super good point that I would just bring up. I think you really nailed it. It's kind of to our benefit for there to be an extension because it is more time for us to take action on these issues. And because we have these marker bills and the executive order, we have tools that we can be saying to them, because it's sort of hard. It's like, who are you going to tell about the farm bill? You're just going to call them up and be like, here's all the things I want in a farm bill. I mean, that's why the farm bill is this huge piece of legislation that is sometimes super hard to access. And I think because we have these marker bills in the executive order, we have opportunities to demonstrate support for the policies we want. And so I think the more we can do that before that deadline, the better off we are. But I think we're going to be, it's probably in our best interest that it gets extended, because they really are far behind in considerations and really viable listening to the people from the countryside.
Yeah, quick policy is rarely in our favor. So I agree with that. And, I mean, people get confused sometimes in the timeline of, why are we talking about it now? And your whole point is, I think, well taken, Rhonda, of like, this is our moment to influence it before they are putting it out. By the time they put out their version, deals have been made, things are a little bit more locked in. So this is a great time to be having these conversations and taking these actions. I will say, we're up on time here. We appreciate everyone hanging with us. I'll remind everybody, if you look over in the Q&A, there are links. You can get to that link tree that has everything on it. That just takes you to a website with all the actions listed. But the cool comments is something we're really, really excited about, because that is the federal window that closes this Sunday. And the more folks we have speaking up about it gives us more strength to go into pushing for mandatory, because we know voluntary is great, but we know who's not going to volunteer. So we appreciate so much. Thank you, Ben and Doug and Rhonda, for your time. Folks had some really good questions. We had some more food questions. I would tease that stay tuned for more Farm Bill events. We're still putting those together, but we know there's a lot to dig through and talk about with, as we said, this massive, massive thing that touches all of our lives. Rhonda, did you have any final thoughts here?
I don't. I would just encourage people, first and foremost, to take the time to take those actions, because they are what really matters. And when you were just talking, Dina, I was reminded about the reason we even have a rule that we are commenting on stopping the false labeling of imported meat products is because of all of us. It's because we've demanded it for numerous years, and we created the power, we built the power to force USDA and the administration to make this a priority. And I think that's what it takes. And that's what all these tools, when you weigh in and you take action, it's building toward those opportunities. And in this case, we've got it to right to the point that we really needed it to be. And that came from people engaging just like you. So it really matters.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again to our speakers. Thank you to everybody for asking your questions and being so engaged. And we will stay tuned and talk to you soon more about Farm Bill. Look out for the email tomorrow with these links on how you can take action and a few more fun facts. So thanks so much, everybody. Have a great day.